On the night of March 16, 1966, in a dimly lit tracking station outside Moscow, Colonel Viktor Petrov stared at telemetry data that violated everything he understood about orbital mechanics. The signals indicated that two American spacecraft, Gemini 8 and an Agena target vehicle, had successfully docked in orbit at an altitude of 160 statute miles, creating a single functioning machine traveling at 17,500 miles per hour. Petrov had spent 3 years analyzing American space attempts, watching their Mercury capsules splash down in the Atlantic after brief suborbital hops, while Soviet cosmonauts circled the Earth. Now his instruments showed Neil Armstrong maneuvering a 3-ton spacecraft with precision measured in inches, accomplishing in 27 minutes what Soviet engineers had been struggling to achieve for 18 months. The colonel reached for the secure telephone to wake his superiors, knowing that the report he was about to deliver would shatter the confident assumptions that had guided Soviet space strategy since Yuri Gagarin's triumph 5 years earlier. The docking represented more than a technical milestone. It meant the Americans had solved problems that Soviet designers still debated in theoretical terms. Computer-assisted rendezvous calculations, attitude control systems capable of hair-trigger precision, radar systems that could track and close on targets across miles of void. Within 6 hours of Armstrong's achievement, 3 separate priority cables reached the Kremlin, each carrying the same urgent message from different intelligence sources. The Americans had demonstrated operational capability in orbit, not just survival but purposeful work, and they had done it with systematic efficiency that suggested far deeper expertise than anyone in Moscow had credited. The space race that Soviet leadership had considered essentially won after Alexei Leonov's spacewalk 11 months earlier suddenly looked like a contest that had barely begun. Petrov understood what the men in Moscow did not yet grasp. He had been reading the open technical literature that NASA published, documents that Soviet secrecy protocols would never permit their own programs to release. The Americans had flown 10 manned missions in 20 months, each one building methodically on the previous flight's accomplishments, each one testing specific capabilities required for a lunar journey. They called it incremental development, and Petrov recognized it as something the Soviet system, with its preference for spectacular firsts and carefully staged propaganda victories, had never truly attempted. The Gemini program represented American industrial capacity applied with patience and precision. And now that patience was yielding returns that Soviet crash programs could not match. But the recognition came late, and it came hard. For nearly 8 years, from Sputnik's launch in October of 1957 through the spring of 1965, Soviet space achievements had dominated headlines and shaped global perceptions of technological superiority. Every major first belonged to Moscow: first satellite, first man in space, first woman in space, first spacewalk, first multi-person crew. American efforts appeared perpetually reactive, always lom's behind, struggling to match accomplishments the Soviets had already achieved. In the councils of the Kremlin and the offices of the Soviet design bureaus, confidence in ultimate victory had hardened into assumption. The Americans had industrial capacity and wealth, certainly, but they lacked the theoretical foundation, the engineering genius, the willingness to take bold risks that characterized Soviet efforts. This confidence rested on genuine achievements, not empty boasting. Sergei Korolev, the chief designer, whose identity remained a state secret even as his creations orbited overhead, had built machines that worked despite operating under constraints American engineers never faced. Soviet rockets used less sophisticated guidance systems because Soviet electronics lagged Western standards. So Korolev designed engines that could be throttled and gimbaled with mechanical precision, compensating for computational limitations with brute force and clever redundancy. Soviet spacecraft carried less capable life support systems, so missions stayed shorter, accomplishing their goals before limitations became critical. Every design reflected ingenious solutions to fundamental material and technological shortfalls, and those solutions had produced results that resonated worldwide. The Voskhod program epitomized this approach. When NASA announced Project Gemini in December of 1961, planning 2-man crews and advanced orbital operations, Korolev responded by modifying the single-seat Vostok capsule to carry multiple cosmonauts. He removed the ejection seat, packed 3 men into a space designed for 1, and launched Voskhod 1 in October of 1964, beating America's first 2-man Gemini flight by 5 months. The crew wore no spacesuits because there was no room for them. The mission lasted barely 24 hours because life support could not sustain longer duration, but the propaganda value was immense. Another Soviet first, another demonstration that the socialist system produced superior results. Leonov's spacewalk on March 18, 1965 represented the culmination of this strategy. The Voskhod 2 mission carried only 2 cosmonauts, Leonov and Pavel Balayaev, specifically to accommodate an inflatable airlock that would allow Leonov to exit the spacecraft. The airlock itself, a fabric tube that extended from the hatch and could be jettisoned after use, exemplified Soviet design philosophy. Minimum weight, maximum audacity, single-use hardware for a single dramatic achievement. Western intelligence estimated the entire structure weighed less than 550 pounds and had been tested exactly once in unmanned configuration before Leonov's life depended on its function. Leonov opened the hatch at 9:30 Moscow time, nearly 90 minutes into the mission's second orbit, and pulled himself into the void. For 12 minutes and 9 seconds, he floated at the end of a 17-foot tether, looking down at the Soviet Union from an altitude of 310 miles. Soviet television cameras captured portions of the event, broadcasting grainy images that electrified audiences worldwide. The spacesuit, white against the blackness, tumbling slowly as Earth rolled beneath, represented a scene from science fiction made tangible. No American had yet left a spacecraft. The Soviet lead appeared insurmountable, but the cameras did not show what happened next. Leonov's suit, exposed to vacuum and sunlight, began expanding beyond its designed parameters. The soft sections ballooned, the joints stiffened, his fingers pulled away from the glove controls. By the time he received the order to return to the spacecraft, the suit had expanded to the point where he could not fit through the airlock opening in a feet-first position as planned. He struggled for 8 minutes, his core temperature rising, his visor fogging, until he made a decision that violated every safety protocol. He partially vented his suit pressure and pulled himself headfirst into the airlock, then somehow managed to turn around in the confined space before repressurizing. The mission's troubles compounded from there. The automatic re-entry system failed, forcing Belayev to manually orient the spacecraft and fire the retro rockets a full orbit later than planned. They landed in heavy forest in the Ural Mountains, 1,200 miles from the intended recovery zone, in late winter conditions. Temperatures dropped to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Wolves circled the capsule during the night. Recovery teams took 2 days to reach them, delivering skis so the cosmonauts could make their way 3 miles through deep snow to a clearing where helicopters could land. Soviet media reported a successful mission and triumphant recovery. Leonov received the Hero of the Soviet Union award, but the engineers understood how narrow the survival margin had been. The Americans knew most of this within days. CIA signals intelligence had tracked the mission's trajectory and identified the late re-entry burn. Analysts calculated the landing zone discrepancy. Agency sources inside the Soviet program, never publicly identified but consistently reliable, reported the suit in fission problem and Leonov's improvised solution. The National Intelligence Estimate circulated in late March of 1965. Concluded that Soviet spacewalk capability existed but remained immature, dependent on individual cosmonaut skill rather than systematic engineering solutions. The estimate proved correct. NASA responded 9 weeks later with a mission profile that revealed fundamentally different assumptions about human spaceflight. Gemini 4, launched June 3, 1965, carried astronauts James McDivitt and Edward White on a 4-day mission designed to test long-duration operations and conduct America's first spacewalk. The spacecraft itself represented capabilities Voskhod could not match. It massed 8,000 pounds fully loaded, nearly twice Voskod's weight, and carried fuel cells that generated electrical power continuously rather than relying on batteries. The crew sat in ejection seats, wore pressure suits throughout the flight, and could control the spacecraft's attitude using either manual or computer-assisted systems. White's spacewalk, conducted on the mission's third orbit, employed hardware tested exhaustively on the ground and in thermal vacuum chambers. His suit, while bulky, maintained structural rigidity through internal pressure compensation. He maneuvered using a handheld gas gun that provided small bursts of thrust, achieving a degree of control Leonov had lacked. The umbilical tether, gold-plated to reflect heat, contained oxygen supply lines, communications links, and a safety cable, all protected within a woven steel jacket, rated to withstand micrometeorite impacts. White spent 23 minutes outside, not because of system limitations, but because mission parameters required his return. The images NASA released showed White moving confidently, his visor clear, his movements precise. The contrast with Soviet footage of Leonov was evident to anyone who examined both carefully. White reported enjoying the experience, famously saying, "I'm coming back in. And it's the saddest moment of my life," when McDivitt ordered him to end the EVA. The comment suggested psychological ease, a man comfortable enough in vacuum to feel regret at leaving. This was not survival, this was capability demonstration, and the difference mattered strategically. Soviet analysts recognized the implications immediately. The State Commission on Spaceflight Technology, a body that coordinated between competing design bureaus and reported directly to the Defense Council, convened an emergency assessment in mid-June. The Commission's report, declassified in portions during the 1990s, acknowledged that American spacesuits provided better thermal control and pressure stability than Soviet models. It noted that American life support systems allowed longer EVA duration without pre-breathing protocols. Most significantly, it projected that NASA would achieve reliable rendezvous and docking capability within 6 months, a milestone Soviet programs might not reach for years. The projection proved optimistic in Soviet favor. Gemini 5, launched August 21, 1965, stayed in orbit for 8 days, shattering the Soviet duration record. Astronauts Gordon Cooper and Pete Conrad orbited Earth 120 times, conducting 17 separate experiments and demonstrating that humans could function effectively in weightlessness for periods exceeding a lunar mission timeline. The spacecraft's fuel cells operated continuously, generating not just power but potable water as a byproduct. Soviet capsules still relied on batteries that limited mission duration to 5 days maximum, and that only with severe power conservation. The duration records were prelude. The core challenge of lunar flight involved spacecraft that could find each other in orbit, close across miles of emptiness, and dock with precision sufficient to create structural connection. American planners had determined that lunar orbit rendezvous, bringing a lunar lander back to dock with a command module orbiting the Moon, offered the only practical path to landing before 1970. Every Gemini mission after number 5 targeted some aspect of rendezvous operations, building capabilities step by systematic step. Gemini 6, originally scheduled for October of 1965, aimed to achieve the first rendezvous between two manned spacecraft. The mission profile called for Gemini 6 to launch, then Gemini 7 would follow 2 weeks later, stay aloft for 14 days, and serve as a target during its final orbits. But on October 25, the Agena target vehicle launched for Gemini 6 exploded 6 minutes into flight, destroying itself and eliminating the rendezvous opportunity. The failure exposed a vulnerability in NASA's incremental approach. Each step depended on hardware that had to work, and complex systems sometimes did not. NASA's response demonstrated program flexibility that Soviet structures could not replicate. Within 72 hours, flight planners proposed launching Gemini 7 as scheduled for its long-duration mission, then launching Gemini 6 during Gemini 7's final days to rendezvous with the manned spacecraft itself, eliminating dependence on an Agena target. The plan required preparing 2 spacecraft simultaneously on adjacent launch pads, something never attempted. It required absolute confidence in launch vehicle reliability, since the rendezvous window would last only hours. And it required convincing headquarters management that the risk was acceptable. Robert Gilruth, director of the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, approved the plan in principle but demanded additional analysis. Gilruth had managed Project Mercury, witnessed Alan Shepard's first American spaceflight in May of 1961, and understood that public confidence in NASA depended on avoiding catastrophic failures. He established a 72-hour review cycle, 3 days for every major decision, with engineering boards examining failure modes and backup procedures before any commitment became final. The approach frustrated pilots who wanted faster progress, but it reflected institutional learning from earlier close calls. The Gemini 7 launch proceeded December 4, 1965, carrying Frank Borman and Jim Lovell for a 14-day mission. 6 days later, with Gemini 7 performing nominally in orbit, Gemini 6 sat on pad 19 with Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford strapped inside. The countdown reached 0, the engines ignited, then shut down instantly. Telemetry showed main engine start followed by immediate cutoff, a sequence that normally meant the rocket had lifted off and released the pad plugs, which should trigger ejection seat activation to throw the crew clear of an exploding booster. Schirra felt no motion. His instruments showed the rocket still firmly on the pad. Procedures called for ejection, but ejection would destroy the spacecraft, end the rendezvous opportunity, and possibly kill both men if the seats fired into a fireball. Schirra made a decision in 3 seconds that senior NASA officials later called the gutsiest call of the program. He stayed seated, hands off the ejection ring, betting his life and Stafford's that his instruments were correct and the Titan II was not about to explode beneath them. He was right. A plastic dust cap had fallen into an oxidizer line, blocking fuel flow and causing an automatic shutdown before the rocket developed thrust. The crew egressed safely, engineers cleared the line, and Gemini 6 launched successfully 3 days later on December 15. 5 hours and 18 minutes after liftoff, Schurrer maneuvered to within 1 foot of Gemini 7's nose, station keeping in formation as both spacecraft crossed the Pacific at 17,500 miles per hour. The rendezvous was so precise that Schurrer could read the lettering on Gemini 7's skin. Soviet tracking stations monitored the entire sequence. They watched 2 American spacecraft maintain formation for more than 5 hours, maneuvering around each other, changing positions with control that demonstrated far more sophisticated attitude systems than Soviet intelligence had estimated. The signals came through clearly because NASA published the radio frequencies in advance and broadcast voice communications in real time. This transparency violated every Soviet operational security principle, yet it served American purposes perfectly. The world could verify the achievement independently. Colonel Petrov, still analyzing American progress from his Moscow station, included a telling paragraph in his January '66 assessment. He noted that NASA had flown 4 manned missions in 7 months, each one demonstrating new capabilities, while Soviet programs had managed no manned flights since Leonov's March EVA. He observed that American Mission Control in Houston coordinated spacecraft operations, with hundreds of personnel monitoring individual systems, communicating openly with crews, making real-time decisions based on shared data. Soviet Mission Control, by contrast, operated behind secrecy walls even from the cosmonauts themselves, with communications filtered through controllers who often lacked complete technical information. The structural differences reflected deeper philosophies. American aerospace companies competed for contracts but shared technical information across programs under NASA coordination. Boeing's work on Saturn boosters informed McDonnell's Gemini spacecraft designs, which incorporated guidance systems developed by MIT's Instrumentation Laboratory, using computers manufactured by IBM to specifications developed by Lockheed. The integration was imperfect and generated massive coordination challenges, but it produced spacecraft that incorporated the best solutions from multiple sources. Soviet design bureaus, by contrast, competed as rivals. Korolev's OKB-1 developed Vostok and Voskhod, but Vladimir Chalamet's OKB-52 worked on separate military spacecraft, and Mikhail Yangel's OKB-58-6 designed different rocket families. Each bureau guarded technical details from the others, concerned that sharing information would strengthen competitors for limited funding. The system encouraged innovation within each bureau but prevented the kind of cross-pollination that accelerated American development. Gemini 8, launched March 16, 1966. Demonstrated how American integration advantages translated to operational capability. Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott lifted off at 11:41 Eastern Time, chasing an Agena target vehicle launched 90 minutes earlier. The Agena, an empty rocket stage retrofitted with docking hardware and attitude thrusters, orbited at 185 miles altitude, its radar beacon transmitting location data that fed directly into Gemini's onboard computer. Armstrong began the rendezvous sequence during the spacecraft's 3rd orbit, firing thrusters to raise Gemini's orbit and adjust its phasing relative to the Agena. The computer, an IBM model that filled a box the size of a briefcase and computing with less power than a 1990 pocket calculator, continuously updated the trajectory solutions. Armstrong monitored the solutions but flew manually, using visual cues and instrument readings to refine his approach. At 6 hours and 33 minutes mission elapsed time, Gemini 8 matched velocities with the Agena at a range of 150 feet. Scott filmed the final approach through the spacecraft window. The footage shows the Agena growing steadily larger, its docking collar centered in the frame, Earth rolling beneath. Armstrong fired forward thrusters in short bursts, each one reducing closure rate, until Gemini's nose contacted the Agena collar at relative velocity under 1 foot per second. Docking latches engaged automatically. 27 minutes after beginning the final approach, the 2 spacecraft were rigidly connected, creating a combined vehicle 43 feet long. The achievement lasted 27 minutes. Then Gemini 8 began rolling uncontrollably, spinning at nearly 1 revolution per second, fast enough to threaten consciousness. Armstrong's first assumption was that the Agena's thrusters had malfunctioned, so he undocked, separating from the target vehicle. The spin accelerated. Scott's vision began tunneling as G-forces pushed blood away from his brain. Armstrong recognized that the problem was on Gemini, not Agena. One of the spacecraft's 16 attitude thrusters stuck firing, and none of the normal control inputs were stopping it. He made another 3-second decision that saved both lives. He deactivated the entire orbital maneuvering system and switched to the re-entry control system, a completely separate set of thrusters reserved for final descent. The re-entry thrusters counteracted the spin, bringing the spacecraft back under control, but mission rules required immediate re-entry once re-entry system fuel was expended. Gemini 8 splashed down in the Pacific after 10 hours and 41 minutes, the shortest Gemini mission, but Armstrong had achieved docking and recovered from a malfunction that would have killed a less capable crew. Soviet analysts studying Gemini 8 focused less on the emergency than on the routine perfection of the rendezvous itself. Armstrong had closed from orbital insertion to docking in less than 7 hours, finding a target across hundreds of miles using instruments and calculations that Soviet spacecraft simply did not carry. The implications for lunar missions were obvious. If Americans could rendezvous in Earth orbit with this precision, they could certainly do it in lunar orbit. And if they could dock reliably, they could employ the lunar orbit rendezvous strategy that avoided the massive rocket Soviet designers believed necessary for direct ascent or Earth orbit rendezvous approaches. Korolev would have grasped this immediately, but Korolev died January 14, 1966, during what should have been routine surgery. He was 59 years old, his health destroyed by years in Stalin's labor camps during the late 1930s, and his death created a leadership vacuum precisely when Soviet programs faced their greatest challenges. Vasily Mishin, his deputy, inherited control of OKB-1 and responsibility for developing the Soyuz spacecraft and the massive N-1 rocket intended for lunar missions. Mishin was a brilliant theoretician, but lacked Korolev's political skills, his ability to navigate Kremlin politics and secure resources when programs encountered difficulties. The Soyuz program, already behind schedule, fell further behind. The spacecraft featured sophisticated automated docking systems, an orbital module separate from the re-entry capsule, and solar panels that could sustain missions for weeks. On paper, Soyuz outclassed Gemini in several respects, particularly in internal volume and theoretical mission duration. But theory required validation through flight, and flights required finishing development, and development stalled without Korolev's driving force. Meanwhile, Gemini continued. Gemini 9, launched June 3, 1966, encountered a docking failure when its Agena target vehicle failed to reach orbit, but the backup mission using an augmented target docking adapter proceeded successfully. Eugene Cernan conducted a spacewalk that lasted 2 hours and 8 minutes, though he exhausted himself struggling with a bulky astronaut maneuvering unit that proved impractical for operational use. The mission revealed that NASA still had not perfected EVA operations, but it demonstrated willingness to acknowledge problems publicly and adjust techniques based on flight experience. Gemini 10, launched July 18th, with John Young and Mike Collins, achieved dual rendezvous, docking first with its own Agena target, then using that Agena's propulsion system to maneuver to a second Agena left in orbit by Gemini 8. Collins spacewalked to the second Agena and retrieved experimental packages from its exterior, demonstrating that astronauts could move between spacecraft and perform useful work in vacuum. The mission's complexity, coordinating between 3 separate orbital vehicles, revealed operational sophistication that Soviet programs had not approached. But the EVA difficulties persisted. Collins, like Cernan before him, exhausted himself during exterior work. Both astronauts struggled with fogged visors, overheating, and tasks that consumed more energy than ground simulations had predicted. NASA convened a review board and concluded that underwater training, using neutral buoyancy to simulate weightlessness, might provide more realistic preparation than existing air-bearing simulators. The suggestion came from Air Force tests and from proposals by several astronauts, but it required new facilities and training protocols. Buzz Aldrin, assigned to Gemini 12, took underwater training seriously. Aldrin held a doctorate in astronautics from MIT, having written his dissertation on orbital rendezvous techniques, and he approached EVA as an engineering problem requiring systematic solution. He spent hours in a water tank at the Aircrew Equipment Laboratory in Maryland, practicing each task he would perform in space, developing techniques to conserve energy and maintain body temperature. He insisted on handholds and foot restraints positioned where he could reach them without excessive effort, simple modifications that previous missions had overlooked. Gemini 12 launched November 11, 1966, the final mission of the program. Jim Lovell commanded, with Aldrin as pilot. They docked with their Agena target on the first orbit, a rendezvous so routine that Houston controllers treated it as a minor milestone. The mission's focus was Aldrin's EVA, scheduled for the second day in orbit. He exited the spacecraft during the mission's 43rd hour, and spent 5.5 hours performing tasks outside, the longest and most successful spacewalk of the program. He changed equipment on the Agena, photographed star fields for navigation research, and operated a power tool, all without the exhaustion and overheating that had plagued earlier EVAs. The success came from preparation, technique, and hardware refinements accumulated across 9 previous missions. Aldrin's visor incorporated better anti-fog coating. His suit used improved thermal control. The handholds and restraints allowed him to position himself without fighting Newton's laws. Underwater training had taught him to move deliberately, to pause and rest, to avoid the frantic activity that generated heat faster than cooling systems could dissipate. When he re-entered Gemini's cabin, his heart rate was actually lower than during some portions of the interior mission, indicating complete comfort in the vacuum environment. Soviet observers watching Gemini 12 recognized that NASA had solved the EVA problem through incremental refinement, exactly the approach that had produced rendezvous and docking capability. 10 missions in 20 months, each one building on previous experience, each one testing solutions to problems identified in flight. The systematic method was less dramatic than Soviet-style spectacular firsts, but it produced reliable operational capability rather than isolated demonstrations. By the program's end in November of 1966, American astronauts had accumulated nearly 2,000 crew hours in orbit, completed 7 successful dockings, and performed 12 spacewalks totaling over 6 hours of productive exterior work. The strategic implications crystallized during 1967 as NASA prepared for Apollo's first manned flights. Soviet intelligence estimates, compiled from multiple sources including signals intercepts, technical literature analysis, and human assets, concluded that Apollo spacecraft would be ready for lunar operations by early 1969, at the latest. The Saturn V rocket, already tested successfully in unmanned configuration in November of 1967, provided more than 7 million pounds of thrust at liftoff, sufficient to send 45 tons toward the moon. No Soviet rocket approached that capacity. The N-1, still in development, had failed ground tests repeatedly and had never flown. Politically, the Soviet position was deteriorating. The 1967 May Day parade in Moscow featured no space hardware for the first time in a decade, a symbolic acknowledgement that recent achievements were sparse. American spacecraft dominated international attention. Soviet leaders understood that the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, celebrated November 7, 1967, would benefit enormously from a space spectacular, but the Soyuz program was not ready. Pressure mounted to fly something, anything, to demonstrate that Soviet space capabilities remained viable. Soyuz launched April 23, 1967, carrying Vladimir Komarov, the experienced cosmonaut who had commanded Voskhod 1 in '64. The mission was supposed to last 3 days and include a docking with Soyuz 2, launched the following day. But problems appeared immediately. One solar panel failed to deploy fully, cutting electrical power. Attitude control systems malfunctioned. Communications were intermittent. By the mission's 5th orbit, controllers decided to abort, bringing Komarov down on the 18th orbit, instead of completing the planned program. Re-entry began successfully. The spacecraft survived atmospheric heating. The drogue parachute deployed at 23,000 feet. Then the main parachute failed, remaining tangled in its container despite Komarov's efforts to manually release it. The backup parachute deployed, but immediately tangled with the drogue, providing almost no drag. Soyuz 1 hit the ground near Orenburg at nearly 80 miles per hour. The impact ruptured propellant tanks, and the spacecraft burst into flames. Komarov was killed instantly, the first human to die during an actual space mission. The investigation revealed systemic problems. Engineers had identified more than 200 design defects before launch, but political pressure to fly before the May Day celebrations had overridden technical caution. The parachute failure resulted from inadequate testing and design flaws that ground simulations had not revealed. The catastrophic outcome forced an 18-month suspension of Soviet manned flights, while engineers redesigned critical systems. By the time Soyuz flew again in October of 1968, American astronauts had completed 5 Apollo missions, including Apollo 7's 11-day orbital shakedown flight that proved every system worked reliably. The contrast was stark. NASA had suffered its own tragedy when fire swept through Apollo 1's cabin during a ground test in January of 1967, killing Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. The agency responded with exhaustive investigation, thousands of design changes, and a methodical return to flight that prioritized crew safety above schedule pressure. Soviet programs, operating under political demands that technical reality could not satisfy, cut corners that killed Komarov and eliminated any realistic chance of beating Apollo to the moon. Soviet cosmonauts understood what was happening. Alexei Leonov, the spacewalker from Voskhod 2, had been training for a lunar mission, expecting to command a circumlunar flight in late 1968. But the N-1 rocket was not ready. The Soyuz remained grounded, and American progress continued relentlessly. When Apollo 8 launched December 21, 1968, carrying Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders on a lunar orbit mission, Leonov was in Star City watching television coverage broadcast by Soviet news agencies. He later wrote that he understood at that moment the race was lost, that American systematic development had overcome Soviet theoretical advantages through superior execution and vastly better resources. Apollo 8 orbited the moon 10 times on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, broadcasting live television of the lunar surface scrolling beneath. The crew read from Genesis, as Earth rose above the moon's horizon, an image that became one of the most reproduced photographs in history. They splashed down in the Pacific December 27th, after a mission that demonstrated American spacecraft could navigate to the moon, operate in lunar orbit, and return safely. Every major obstacle except the landing itself had been overcome, and the landing hardware was already being tested in Earth orbit. Soviet lunar programs attempted to continue. The N-1 rocket launched 4 times between February of 1969 and November of 1972. All 4 launches failed, 3 catastrophically. The second launch, July 3, 1969, destroyed the launch pad when the rocket fell back, seconds after liftoff, and exploded with force equivalent to 7 kilotons. One of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. No Soviet cosmonaut ever got closer to the moon than Earth orbit. The lunar landing program was quietly terminated after Apollo 11 succeeded in July of '69. Though official acknowledgement would not come for years. American success, built directly on Gemini's foundation. Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, July 20, 1969, but the capability that put him there began with his March '66 docking aboard Gemini 8. The rendezvous techniques Buzz Aldrin developed for his MIT thesis and refined during Gemini 12 guided the lunar module Eagle up from the moon's surface to dock with Columbia in lunar orbit. The EVA procedures perfected through 12 Gemini spacewalks allowed Armstrong and Aldrin to work outside on the lunar surface for 2.5 hours, collecting samples and deploying experiments without exhaustion or equipment failure. Between July of '69 and December of '72, NASA landed 12 Americans on the moon across 6 missions. Apollo 13's lunar landing was aborted after an oxygen tank explosion, but the crew returned safely, demonstrating system redundancy and operational flexibility under emergency conditions. The final 3 missions carried lunar rovers that extended exploration ranges to several miles. Total EVA time on the lunar surface exceeded 80 hours. Astronauts collected 842 pounds of lunar samples, deployed 5 scientific instrument stations, and demonstrated that humans could perform complex geological work in spacesuits on another world. The Soviet Union pivoted to different achievements. They developed the Salyut space station program, launching the first station in April of 1971, 3 months before NASA's Skylab. Soviet crews eventually achieved duration records, living aboard Mir space station for more than a year at a time during the 1990s. Mir itself orbited continuously from February of 1986 to March of 2001, demonstrating Soviet expertise in long-duration orbital operations. These were genuine accomplishments, but they represented a strategic redirection after losing the moon race that had defined the first space age. The reconciliation came symbolically in July of 1975, when Apollo and Soyuz spacecraft docked in orbit during the Apollo-Soyuz test project. Tom Stafford, who had flown on Gemini 6, 9, and 10, commanded the American crew. Alexei Leonov, the first spacewalker, commanded Soviet. The 2 men shook hands through the docking tunnel, while television cameras broadcast the moment worldwide. It represented détente in miniature, Cold War competitors cooperating in space, even as ideological struggles continued on Earth. Stafford and Leonov had developed genuine respect during training for the mission. Respect grounded in shared understanding of what spaceflight demanded from those who attempted it. Leonov acknowledged in conversations with Stafford that American systematic development had proven superior to Soviet spectacular demonstrations, though he could not say so publicly while the Soviet Union existed. Stafford respected Soviet cosmonauts' courage, even as he recognized that courage without adequate system support meant taking risks American programs had learned to avoid. The historical lesson was clear by the time Gemini veterans began retiring from NASA in the 1970s. Incremental progress, transparent operation, systematic testing, and adequate funding produced capabilities more reliably than dramatic gestures driven by propaganda requirements. The Soviet Union achieved genuine firsts through bold engineering and willingness to accept risks that American political culture would not tolerate. But those firsts did not translate to sustainable programs capable of accomplishing complex objectives like lunar landings. The American model, patient and methodical, built competence that enabled achievement beyond any single spectacular mission. Colonel Viktor Petrov, who had tracked American progress from Moscow throughout the 1960s, emigrated to the United States in 1978, settling in Florida, where he occasionally consulted for space industry contractors. In 1996, he attended a NASA symposium on Gemini program history and found himself seated next to Neil Armstrong during a reception. The two men had never met, though Petrov had monitored every minute of Armstrong's Gemini 8 flight 30 years earlier. Petrov introduced himself and explained his role in Soviet space tracking during the 60s. Armstrong asked what conclusions Soviet analysts had drawn about Gemini's success. Petrov considered his answer carefully, then said that Soviet reports had emphasized American material advantages and funding levels, treating the outcome as essentially predetermined by economic factors. But those reports, he told Armstrong, had missed the real lesson. American success came from cultural willingness to acknowledge problems, share information, and build solutions incrementally. Soviet programs operated in secrecy, even from themselves, with design bureaus hiding difficulties from leadership until crises forced acknowledgement. That structural difference, Petrov said, mattered more than any resource disparity. Armstrong nodded, then offered his own observation. He said that Gemini crews had always known they flew missions designed by hundreds of engineers who shared data, tested relentlessly, and built backup systems for critical functions. That knowledge created confidence, and confidence allowed focus on objectives rather than survival. He had docked with Gemini on his first try because the computer worked, the radar worked, the thrusters worked, all with reliability demonstrated through previous flights. Soviet cosmonauts, from everything he had learned, flew machines that might work but also might not, and that uncertainty demanded different kinds of courage than American crews needed. Both approaches reached orbit, Armstrong said, but only one approach reached the moon. The conversation lasted 10 minutes. Two veterans of opposite sides discussing what they had learned. Petrov later wrote that Armstrong's comment about confidence struck him as exactly right. Soviet cosmonauts had been brave to the point of recklessness because their systems demanded it. American astronauts had been calm and methodical because their systems permitted it. Courage and technical competence both mattered, but systematic development created conditions where competence could flourish without requiring impossible heroism. That insight, more than any specific hardware comparison, explained why 12 Americans walked on the moon while no Soviet cosmonaut ever left Earth orbit for lunar space. The International Space Station, assembled beginning in '98 and continuously occupied since November 2000, represents the full arc of that evolution. Russian modules and American modules dock seamlessly using interfaces descended from Apollo-Soyuz hardware. Crews from dozens of nations live aboard for months at a time, conducting research impossible on Earth. The station orbits at 250 miles altitude, visible from the ground as a bright moving star, a cooperative achievement that would have seemed impossible to Colonel Petrov, watching Armstrong dock Gemini 8 in March of '66. But the cooperation became possible only after competition resolved the fundamental question about which system could accomplish objectives beyond orbit. Gemini answered that question between March of '65 and November of '66, demonstrating capabilities through 10 missions that Soviet programs could not match despite years of trying. The answer shaped subsequent decades of space activity and established principles that still guide human spaceflight. Test before you fly, build incrementally, share information, fund adequately, and respect the engineering process even when political pressure demands shortcuts. Those lessons, learned through Gemini's systematic development and validated by Apollo's success, remain the foundation for everything humans have accomplished beyond Earth's atmosphere. If you found this exploration of Cold War space capabilities compelling and want more deep dives into the technologies, strategies, and human stories that defined the superpower confrontation from 47 to 91, subscribe now for documentaries that reveal how American innovation overcame Soviet surprise across every domain from orbital mechanics to submarine acoustics. The next episode examines how American signals intelligence satellites detected Soviet missile tests in real time, while Soviet space reconnaissance struggled with film return capsules that worked less than half the time, a technical gap that shaped nuclear strategy throughout the 60s and 70s.